Complexity is a big topic, one that many people have struggled with. There are many different ways of measuring complexity, but one attribute which seems to get a lot of attention is unpredictability. This is often given as one of the main characteristics of complex systems, but this should not be exaggerated. Complex systems are a mixture of predictability and unpredictability. Only chaotic systems are completely unpredictable. If we want to track what is happening within complex systems, we will need a combination of predefined measures and open-ended methods of inquiry, such as most significant change. We will also need to pay attention to a second facet of complexity, which I think does not yet get sufficient attention. This is diversity, both as a cause and a consequence of change. The diversity of actors, their ambitions and activities, and their relationships. Here again, I think we will need both defined measures and open-ended forms of inquiry. For predefined measures, we can learn a lot from the field of ecology, which has many different ways of measuring the dimensions of diversity. And ethnographic forms of inquiry can also provide us with tools, such as pile sorting, which will help us explore and appreciate the more subjective, informal, and tacit nature of diversity. Theories of change do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in contexts which can impose multiple and often conflicting constraints. Two tensions come to mind. The first is between planning and openness. To be useful as a planning tool, a theory of change must be able to articulate expectations about means and ends in some detail. But there also needs to be some capacity to cope with unplanned events. One way of managing this tension is to recognize and make use of the inherent diversity present in many interventions. There is also a tension between the requirements of a theory of change to be useful for evaluation purposes and for communication purposes. To be useful for an evaluation, a theory of change requires details and technical specifics. But to be useful for communication purpose, a theory of change requires some simplicity and good design. One way in which this tension has been managed is by the use of hyperlinked web pages, as you'll see in an example shortly. These fall into two broad types, tables and diagrams. Logical frameworks are probably the most well-known example of a theory of change in a table form. They are notable for their emphasis on measurement and data sources. Two of the four columns in a logical framework serve this purpose. And for the fact that they segment time into discrete categories known as inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. On the other hand, network diagrams place much more emphasis on describing causal linkages and giving relatively little attention to measurement requirements. Within this broad second category, there are various options, such as network diagrams, which show causal influences all working in one direction from activities to outcomes. Or they can include feedback loops where some events are both influencing and influenced by others. While most theories of change are essentially static snapshots of a system, it is now possible to build more dynamic models whose values change as a result of the interaction of its parts. My overall impression is that there is no shortage of options on how theories can be represented, but there does seem to be a limited amount of imagination being applied to exploring the use of these options. There are other problems as well which have been around for a long time and can still be seen in evaluations. All too many theories of change describe expected events at the outcome and impact levels in abstract and general terms, which are inevitably difficult to observe or verify. This problem can be easily addressed by making sure the description of such changes are actor-orientated. That is, we know who is doing what and when. When we look at theories of change, probably the most useless version is the one that simply describes how a list of things at one stage will lead to a list of things at the next stage, and so on. This can be seen in some less helpful versions of a logical framework and in a surprising number of high-level strategy documents. The third problem of concern to me is the fact that even when we do have an articulated connections between different events in a theory of change, we are not told very much about what is happening there. We often do not know what kind of processes are involved, for example, whether it involves an exchange of money or knowledge or influence. Nor do we know about the strength of the processes described in any relative or absolute terms. All these problems should be easy to recognize and address. In this slide, I have two more positive examples. On the left is a very simple diagrammatic theory of change, apparently with some of the limitations of the kind already described. We don't know anything about the linkages that connect one event to the other. But in this example, the network diagram is viewable as a web page, and visitors to the site can click on any of the links and be taken to a supporting web page describing the nature of that linkage in considerable detail, describing what was expected and what the historical evidence was for that likely to be possible. In the second example, we see a much more complex network diagram generated through a participatory design process and subsequently represented in the form of a fuzzy cognitive map, or FCM. A key feature of interest with fuzzy cognitive maps is that because all the links are given directions and values, and because of the existence of feedback loops, it is possible to create a dynamic model whereby when a change is made to the scale of one of the events, this then triggers measurable changes in all the others. In this slide, I raise the question of whether the way we use the theory of change to inform an evaluation is too narrow in focus. In the last slide, I was talking about causal linkages between events. Understandably, there's a necessary focus on identifying and explaining how things are happening so they can be replicated with confidence. But explanatory questions are only one of at least 5 different types of questions that an evaluation can ask, which you can see listed here. A good theory of change might be able to suggest some of these other types of evaluation questions. The capacity to generate testable propositions is central to the definition of science. So, should we be expecting something similar from theories of change? Should we expect theories of change to contain testable hypotheses about what will happen? For example, defined in terms of what events or combinations of events are necessary or sufficient for an outcome to occur, or about the relative importance of different events in the causes of others, or the absolute values of some interventions necessary to cause an outcome. My own experience suggests that theories of change with this sort of capacity are rare. Perhaps I should lower my expectations. Could we at least expect a theory to generate some testable hypotheses identified through a structured interaction between evaluation teams and intervention stakeholders, either at the design stage or at the inception phase of an evaluation? For developments along these lines happening at a larger scale, you might want to visit the Social Science Prediction Platform. I started this presentation with a comment about the importance of giving more attention to diversity when thinking about complex systems, such as when seen in large-scale interventions involving people in multiple locations and organisations. While tables and diagrams are useful instruments for describing theories of change from a temporal perspective, there is an alternative approach. This gives primary attention to differences within a given period of time, as seen in different locations, organisations, or other entities described generically as cases. Within the description of those cases, there can be attributes describing changes that have taken place. Time is not ignored, it is just given second place. There are at least 3 different ways of carrying out this diversity-orientated approach. Probably the most well-known amongst evaluation specialists is the use of qualitative comparative analysis, or QCA. But there are also forms of supervised machine learning which can generate similarly complex analyses of differences between cases and generate predictions of expected outcomes. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are also ethnographic methods that can do this, notably some forms of pile sorting, which I will now give an example of. Here is an example of a case-based analysis using an ethnographic approach. This is the documented result of a reiterated pile sorting exercise involving a group of NGOs in Nigeria. The cases which were sorted by them were the names of different NGOs working in the region, seen on the far right. You can see a branching structure starting off with large-scale differences at the left and progressively differentiating to the right. I won't go into the details of this method right now, but you can see that this type of nested structure can contain a lot of information. In addition, once the tree structure is developed, predictions can be elicited about the expected performance of one group versus the other at each junction in the tree. This sort of approach has some practical value. In the Nigerian example, the purpose was all about design, how to identify NGO partners with appropriate skills that could contribute to a large-scale rural development program. But it also has potential uses as an alternative approach to stakeholder analysis. Traditionally, stakeholders in a development intervention would be named and identified within a 2x2 matrix based on 2 predefined criteria of interest and influence. My experience with reviewing other agency evaluation reports is that this type of stakeholder analysis has surprisingly little influence on the actual subsequent design and implementation of an evaluation. I am now supporting a project team working on a project in South Africa which requires a stakeholder analysis to inform how the project proceeds with a public consultation. This will make use of the same sort of tree structure as used in Nigeria, which will be developed in a workshop setting. A web app version of the process is also under development to enable wider participation in this kind of process. I now want to turn to another form of diversity in methods of analysis, as distinct from diversity of ways of representing theories of change. Large projects inevitably generate a large number of potential evaluation questions. With that range, we might expect a necessary diversity of methods to answer these questions. Unfortunately, this is often not the case. In my own experience, evaluations tend to give a lot of attention to methods of data collection and insufficient attention to methods of data analysis. One way to think about different methods of data analysis is in terms of the types of relationships between measures of interest. I have 2 examples which might be useful. The first one is from Julian King, describing quite clearly the relationship between 5 different terms that often pop up in evaluations. That is, economy, efficiency, effectiveness, cost-effectiveness, and equity. The second way of thinking about different kinds of relationship-based analyses can be seen in this set of tables. The table on the top left describes one-to-one relationships, which can be investigated using simple cross-tabulations and linear correlations. The next describes many-to-one relationships, where we might be trying to find out what was the cause of an effect of interest. Here we might be using multiple regression and QCA type configurational analyses. The third is the analysis of one-to-many relationships, where we might be looking at which of the many effects that have been noticed are associated with a particular intervention. And the fourth is about many-to-many relationships, where we might need to do a detailed case study or some form of network mapping or a form of cluster analysis. Before moving on to the second part of my presentation, I want to draw attention to this quote from a British philosopher. It emphasises the need to think about how we represent things, in text, tables, or diagrams or other means. Those choices shape how we think about things that are being represented. The bigger range we have of methods of representation, the better. In these next few slides, I want to provide a description of a method I think some of you know about, and some of you may know more about it than others. MSE stands for Most Significant Change. It's name of a method of participatory monitoring and evaluation which is based on a collection of stories of change from participants whose views we are concerned about. This kind of method is relevant to projects and evaluations dealing with complexity, where we need a combination of predefined measures of progress and open-ended methods that will capture emerging and unexpected changes. Although the complete method has 10 different steps in its implementation, the absolute core of the method is the use of two questions which firstly elicit and then secondly select the most significant changes that people report. Since its development in the 1990s and this 2005 guide, MSE has now been adopted and adapted in many different countries, in many different sectors, by many different organisations. So it is probably worthwhile giving some attention in this presentation. In this slide, I've listed some of the reasons that people are using MSC. Although originally designed as a means of participatory monitoring, it is now widely used as part of an evaluation. It has been widely used to clarify people's values, what an intervention should be seeking to do, or the kinds of effects it has had and their value. It has also been very useful as a means of identifying possible effects of a cause, that is, of all the things happening in someone's life which might be associated with an intervention. Even a single MSC account can be useful. In an evaluation context, it can provide a useful illustrative example of the existence of an event that might not have been previously expected. When sufficiently detailed, it can help elaborate the causal processes involved in a change. And if significant, a single case can prompt immediate action. Single cases can also be sufficient to disprove any claims that something is necessary or sufficient. And there is the capacity to do analyses of the whole set of MSC stories using well-established methods of content analysis to identify the prevalence of sources of different kinds of change. MSC is not a method that can be used anywhere and everywhere. There are some kinds of circumstances where it is likely to be most useful. These include large complex programs that are likely to have emergent outcomes, large programs with multiple organisational layers, each trying to interpret what is taking place, interventions that are focused on social change and which have a participatory ethos. And almost at an opposite extreme, MSC has also been found to be very useful in small-scale but highly customised services to small numbers of people, such as participants in training events and users of counselling services. Not surprisingly, there are also quite a few misunderstandings and misuses of MSC. MSC, when correctly implemented, is not about the collection of success stories. It's about the collection of stories about significant changes which may or may not be positive from one perspective or another. MSC stories are not meant to be representative of what is happening, but they can be representative of what people think is desired. Although we are conditioned to see individual accounts of changes as inherently biased, I don't think this is necessarily or absolutely the case. If we ask people not only to describe what has happened, but also their thinking about why that is significant to them. Sometimes claims about the use of MSE need to be discounted. For example, when people are simply asking about changes, but not requiring respondents to focus on the most significant change. Or if MSE stories have been collected, but there is no subsequent selection process. or if the selection process is driven by predetermined selection criteria. The use of MSC is inherently retrospective. We are asking people about what has happened and what they think about that. Their answers tell us about their own theories of change, both what is desired and how things are working towards or against those ends. In contrast, theories of change as used by organisations are inherently more single-minded. They tend to be convergent, describing how various activities are all working with various degrees of interaction towards the achievement of one or few objectives. They are also predictive in that they describe what is expected to happen if various preconditions are fulfilled. In contrast to this approach, it's worth looking at how those working in the fields of foresight or futures look at the future. While it is a very diverse field, it is generally the case that futures methods explore divergent futures at the various possibilities that might take place, not just one single future. And rather than being predictive, their intention is more preparative, aiming at enabling the identification of different kinds of responses that might be useful in different future answers. Intrinsic to this capacity is the need for a sufficient diversity of views. In this last slide, I want to quickly introduce you to ParEvo, a web-assisted process enabling the participatory exploration of alternative futures. These futures take the form of storylines developed in the form of a branching tree, where each branch describes a different possible future. Each storyline is built up from multiple contributions of different participants, making use of their diversity of backgrounds, skills, and knowledge. While the generation of storylines requires imagination, in order to make this process useful, it is also necessary to build in evaluation to identify critical differences between these possible futures and their potential implications for actions that need to be taken. As indicated very early in this presentation, an evaluation process can make use of both predefined and emergent criteria to identify different significant types of futures. In conclusion, perhaps, there is a role for evaluation skills, not only for examining what has happened in the past, but also to examine how we think about what might happen in the future.